Barnes & Noble Audio.
I'm Miwa Messer from Barnes & Noble. We've been waiting for Morgan Jerkins. We've been waiting for a writer like her to kick on the door, driven by curiosity, fearless and free with questions of herself, of the status quo, of everything she's been taught is true. This Will Be My Undoing is Morgan's first essay collection, and in it she writes beautifully and with great honesty, covering everything from home and family, faith and books, to body image and sexuality, privilege, and race. The result is the story of one young woman's intellectual and emotional growth. The booksellers, some 20-something and some not, who select books for our Discover Great New Writers program, were knocked out by Morgan's voice on the page, by turns pointed and assured, and at other moments anxious and self-effacing. Readers who couldn't get enough of the essay collections Bad Feminist by Roxane Gay and The Empathy Exams by Leslie Jamison won't want to miss this fabulous debut. Morgan joins us here in the studio to talk about This Will Be My Undoing. Thank you, Morgan. It's good to see you.
Good to see you, too.
Can we start with Dostoevsky?
Yes.
All right. Your stepfather is ill, and you turn to Dostoevsky because he makes chaos and crazy look normal. And yet, you don't just read Dostoevsky. You decide you're going to study Russian after studying Japanese. So would you talk about that for a second?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not even sure how I came across Dostoevsky. I think I was reading a passage somewhere online, and I really liked how he wrote about duality, even in the most mundane circumstances. Having doppelgangers, having the devil appear one night while you're sitting in the corner and you see like the curtains ruffling and then the devil appears. These sort of circumstances that are supernatural, because I often believe that reality can be fantastic depending on your vantage point. And so Dostoevsky still is one of my favorite authors because he's able to write about human emotions so well, in a way that you really, if you really dig into the prose and the characters, you can't pathologize them really because you can understand where they're coming from. So yes, my stepfather was ill. He had frontal temporal lobe dementia and advanced Alzheimer's, so a lot of it is like memory, things like that. So I was really interested in the characters who had a breakdown of cognitive function. And I wanted to read Russian because I remember vividly that I studied comparative literature at college, and there was this comparative literature dinner where all of these professors were reading translations. And there was this one woman who, if you know about Slavic languages and literature, her name is Carol Emerson. She's like the preeminent scholar in that field, and she was one of my advisors when I was a junior. And she read Eugene Onegin, Alexander Pushkin's Eugene Onegin, and she read a dream sequence and 3 translations, and they were all vividly different from one another. So I went up to her and I was like, I think I want to study Russian. And she was like, do it. And then that was it. I'd never had that sort of enthusiasm from a professor before, or an educator, especially a white educator. I mean, coming from a school system where I've had, educators say to me, you should not try to apply to Princeton. It's not. Your parents might not be able to afford it. I've had teachers. I came from a school system where teachers would straight up ask my parents if I were cheating. White educators. So to have a professor at this institution just say, without hesitation, I should study it, that made me just go forth and do it.
And you studied Russian and Japanese at the same time.
Yeah, I studied other languages at the same time, but I studied a new language each year.
How many languages do you speak?
Besides English? 5. So, with varying degrees of fluency, but yeah.
Why write essays? I mean, you have this great love for these very long, complicated novels, and yet you've chosen to write essays.
Well, I think because I got into writing in general as a place to hide. When I was in high school, as I mentioned in the first chapter of my book, I was bullied every single day, harboring these suicidal ideations. And so I wanted to write because I wanted to create new worlds and create new friends, as cheesy as that sounds. And I was mimicking people who didn't look like me through my prose. And it wasn't until my first term in MFA program where my advisor said, you need to read these Black authors. And it was also during that time where I didn't get a job right out of college. I was applying for all of these entry-level positions in publishing, and I wasn't getting anything, and I was devastated. So right around the time when I was in an MFA program learning about craft, I was spending a lot of time online learning about voice. And that was around the time when the murder of Michael Brown happened, and the Black Lives Matter movement began. And so there was this necessity and this push from editors they wanted Black voices. And so because I was on the computer 10 hours a day, maybe, I was like, why don't I just start writing things? And then I did. And then someone was like, oh, you're really honest about these issues. And it just felt like there was an awakening that happened. And I felt like I can write through other genres and not have to hide myself so much, and people will gravitate towards it.
Well, and this goes back to duality, and not just Dostoevsky, but duality in general. You have always functioned in more than one world. I mean, you've gone to schools that are predominantly white. You've lived in predominantly white communities.
I'm also a Gemini, too.
Oh, well, there's that. There's that. You say in the first essay, actually, that you didn't realize you were Black until you were 10. Because you wanted to be a white cheerleader. Can you talk about that a little bit for people who haven't read the book yet?
Yes. So I knew I was different from other girls, whether it was hair texture, the shape of my nose, those sorts of things. But it wasn't until there was this moment. And I think if you look in pop culture, you know that the cheerleaders are always at the top of the social hierarchy. Usually the cheerleaders are white women, often white girls, blonde white girls. And you might have one Black girl sprinkled in there just for tokenism's sake. And so I wanted to be a part of cheerleading squad because I wanted to be seen as beautiful, not knowing that I was making this connection between whiteness and beauty. So I wanted to try out for the cheerleading squad because I wanted to be seen as beautiful, and all the popular girls were the white girls. And it was a painstaking effort. Even at 10 years old, I wanted to not only learn these jumps and these smiles, but also mimic their types of mannerisms, where they shopped, how they talked, all sorts of things, both in and out of practice. And so when cheerleading tryouts came along, when we actually had to try out, I thought that I was going to make it because I was very robotic. I had everything down. And when we went into the tryout room, which was like this gym area, it was me and this other girl. She was an Afro-Dominican girl. And, I did the jumps and everything like that, but the other Black girl sort of stumbled, and she just paused and she couldn't get through it. And I knew maybe that was a form of respectability politics, where I was like, I have to be better than her because she slipped up. I have to be even better. And when I finished, I thought I did everything right, and no Black girls made it that night. Granted, there was only a few Black girls to begin with, but none of us made it. And then I was like, okay, I'm sad, but I got over it. And my mother spoiled me, and I was like, okay, it's done. And then maybe 1 or 2 weeks later, I had a friend of mine who was a girl of color, but she was Filipina, and she had ingratiated herself in Black circles. She was very much like, I'm going to dress like you, I'm going to talk like you, all these things. And we got into an argument over something that was very petty. And then she says to me, why you didn't make the cheerleading squads? Because monkeys like you don't make cheerleading squad. And it was that moment where I didn't even know what to say to that. And it was interesting because when I was writing my book proposal for this book, that was the first thing that I knew I wanted to write. It took, I don't want to brag, but it took no effort. It was just, as soon as I was going to write about Black girlhood, it was like, where was the start? And that was the start, with how I knew that I was different from these white girls because I was Black, but also at a moment's notice, someone could use both these attributes against me as a way to say that I'm not human. And so I was never able to process it from that moment, because I think a lot of times, and I can't speak for all Black women, but there are certain moments where you don't want to dwell too much on it because it takes you into a dark space and you just want to get on with your day. So what do? Oftentimes you start to normalize it, because if you don't, if you keep setting aside these certain moments to say that was not normal, that was hurtful, then it's harder to sit with the world. It's harder to sit with the world and make space for yourself to care and open up about it rather than seeing it as a rite of passage.
Even as a young girl, other people are making judgments about your body, your presence in the world, the way you carry yourself, the way you study, what you're supposed to study, how you're supposed to behave. And it's not just schools. It's your mom. It's your mom's community. There's so many people saying this is who you're supposed to be.
Right. Well, I think one thing I want to say about my mother is that my mother grew up in a neighborhood where she was only one or two black families on the block. The Ku Klux Klan used to burn crosses in their backyard. And so my grandfather had to drive her and her three siblings every single day to the bus stop because they were afraid of white kids who would throw deformed cats on them. So when you think about that type of conditioning, what are you supposed to do for survival? How is a black mother supposed to tell you this is how you survive, right? So yes, I mean, you want somebody to go against the grain, but how are you going to go against the grain when you're not even in the game? So she understood from, she sort of embedded in me from an early age, listen, if you want to stand out, you have to play by these rules. You have to look the part. You have to talk a certain way. Your hair can't be this way. And she did it as a way to ensure that I would have social mobility and professional mobility. And so that's the hard thing is that, a lot of times I'm very active on Twitter, and people will say respectability politics won't save you, which is true. If it's a matter of life or death, respectability politics won't save you. But we can't gloss over the fact that if you look at any black public figure, they have to be respectable in front of people who do not look like themselves, because if they don't, then that opens up the possibility for this person is going to be stereotypical towards me. You know what I mean? Like there was a GIF I saw where President Obama was going into former President Obama, was going into the basketball locker room, and he shook the white man's hand, then he dapped up the basketball player's hand. Like that's just code switching, because he knows that if I dap up another black person, they're still going to see me as human. They're not going to use that against me. So again, it's a form of survival. Is it very problematic? Yeah, it is, because then you get into the whole idea of like, because when you become too respectable, then there are instances where white people will say, oh, you're not that type of black person, which is a whole other minefield.
Which we will get to in a second. We will absolutely get to. I want to go back to your mom for a second, though, because she's a little bit of a maverick. She actually suggested that you try therapy after your stepfather was diagnosed with Alzheimer's and the frontal temporal lobe dementia. Your mom said, okay, it's the moment, sweetheart. You need to go talk to someone, which is rare in communities of color. We are not great about saying, go get help.
Right. Well, because my late stepfather was a psychologist. And I think, I'm not going to say that was 100% of the reason why she told me to go, but that was part of the reason. He was a black 6 guy from North Carolina, and he was always, talking about therapy, even in implicit ways, taking phone calls in the middle of the night. Like that was who he was. So yeah, my mom was a maverick in a lot of ways. I think when I get into the chapter about like my sexuality and all that, people really they were really shocked of the things she suggested.
How did your mom respond to that? Well, not just that chapter, but how did she respond to the book?
She texted me at midnight, literally 3 days ago, and was like, "I really liked it." And it was interesting because my mom usually goes to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock. So for her to stay up till midnight to finish it meant a lot. And she also told me she had a 3-hour-long conversation with her parents.
Oh, wow.
Because she said, I'm 51 years old and I wish that I was as brave as you. Because there are certain things that I could never have said, and I never had the space to say. So it was a lot of reckoning going on in my family and in the tight-knit Christian community in which I was raised.
Well, and again, I'm going to go back to this idea of duality, because who you are on the page isn't necessarily, I mean, you talk about some deeply personal stuff beyond the bullying, beyond, the sexuality bits and whatnot. You do talk about what it means to be Black in a gentrifier. I mean, that was the piece you wrote for The Guardian that went viral. I mean, you were asking a lot of questions that not everyone would ask.
Right. Because we don't live in a black and white world. I don't care how many characters we are given on Twitter or how much we want to incite people to have these really different emotions on the spectrum, like left or right. Life is much more complicated than that and much more nuanced. And I don't personally like situations where someone asks me a question or a group of people a question, they immediately give a fast response. Because for me, I always think very deeply, and luckily I'm surrounded by people who never say, are you overthinking something? And I think that's what helped me with the writing process. Says, why don't I just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper?
But at the same time, you've asked yourself if you have too many opinions and you talk too much, and if you're not docile enough, because dating has been tricky. How do you reconcile those two parts?
Honestly, being successful helps.
Well, yes,
learning that, hey, like I have an opinion and I can sustain myself helps. But I don't think that's ever going to change. I told someone the other day, I said one of the worst things that someone could say to me if they meet me in person is that I'm intimidating. That hurts way more than calling me a bitch or the C word. Not the N word, no. But any of those loaded terms, if you call me intimidating, that hurts so much because I've experienced so many years of people, especially women, giving me these talks that were always laced with friendly admonition, letting me know that hey, you are very opinionated, but these are the guys that are not going to be attracted to you because of that. These are the guys you can only date because they can't handle you otherwise. And when you keep hearing that from women of your community, when you get signals from men implicitly and explicitly that says, you're a little bit too much. There were so many moments where I was just like, why are the things that I should be proud about, my Blackness, my womanhood, and my writing, why are they used against me? Why do people weaponize these things against me? Because and tell me I'm not deserving of love because of that. And so dating has been tricky because a lot of people don't want to admit this to themselves, but Black women are seen as the least desirable. We're always mocked, being too loud, your hair isn't right, you're not marriageable. And so when you are, I am a heterosexual Black woman, I do want to get married. When you're getting all these signals of, here are the restrictions that you have, not only because you're a woman, because you're successful and you're Black, it's like, why can't you just let me live? Why don't you ever give men the narrative that they need to step up to me, or at least be okay with someone having an actual conversation with them? It's like Black women are loaded with all of these signals that they have to fix themselves. But who's helping us? Why we always have to help everyone else and build everyone else up and devote all this emotional labor to everyone else. But who is doing that the same for us? Who is fixing themselves for us?
Well, isn't that the stereotype, though, that Black women are the strongest in their communities?
Yeah, it's
right,
but it's like, that's why I made that satirical chapter about how to be docile. You're doing everything you can to make someone disappear. You're not asking the questions of what the world has done to make this Black woman shrink and whether or not it's their fault. But there's always something that's wrong with us because intrinsically that's what you believe. There's this flaw that you just can't pluck out.
Can we talk about the structure of How to Be Docile for a second? Because that is an amazing piece of work. It's a series of bullet points. And it is really, really ferocious and it's marvelous. But did you start writing that as a series of bullet points, or did you start it just as, I'm going to write this piece, I'm going to do this riff, let's see where it goes?
I was at my father's house with my aunt, and my aunt and I were having a conversation about dating. My aunt has been divorced for quite some time, and she was the one that was like, you know what you should do? She was like, you should go have an experiment. And next time you go on Tinder or whatever you kids do nowadays, go on a date with someone, and next time the guy starts asking you questions, dial it back a little bit. Like, be docile and see what happens. And I don't know, and she wasn't saying it in a way, she was saying it as a way that you should just see what happens, because I'm telling you, you'll get different responses. And after that conversation, I was like, you know what? I am going to make a chapter called How to Be Docile. And it's basically the undertone is going to be, kiss my ass and leave us alone. And I didn't want to write it in like, paragraphs. No, because I'm just gonna get down to the root. I'm just gonna cut to the chase. And I was worried that my editor was gonna be like, what is this? Like, there's like, because it feels like a break. So I was very nervous about that chapter, but that ferocity that I'm glad you picked up on, that was real.
Where did the title come from?
Man, I don't want to say I don't know. I do know that I thought of the title while I was constructing the book proposal, and I was hearing a lot thrown online about unlearning things, and I thought there's so many great words that start with the prefix unlearning, unraveling, and I was like, undoing. So when I was writing the first couple of chapters of the book and thinking about the chronology and going backwards, I was thinking almost like a zipper, or just like a thread you just have to like pull. And I just thought about it in that way. I was like, in order for me to show you where I am now, I have to go back to some of the ugliest memories that I just never talked to anyone about. So when I say like, this will be my undoing, I'm just saying I'm unraveling things, but also to signal to other people that this book is not irresolute, because I'm still alive. And there are other things that I'm going to go through, and I might read this 25 years later and then be able to nuance it a little more and have a conversation with myself. So,
What did your dad think of the book?
My dad liked it. I mean,
you really don't leave anything out, I have to say.
Well,
you leave nothing out.
Because I said to myself, you know, I've been in book publishing since 2015, the fall 2015. And I told myself, I said, listen, this is your debut, so you better bring it. There are too many books in a bookstore that anyone could pick up. And this is before the book cover and all that. I was like, why are they going to pick up yours? So I wanted to be a situation where it's like, I don't want to flip to any page of my book and say, man, I could have said way more there, but I didn't. And there's no page in that book where I'm like, I could have said, like, no, I think I said enough. But I also had great editors who told me, who were able to tell when I was psychologically cutting corners and said, no, you need to go back.
All of this material is original to the book, right?
Most of it. Yeah, there were certain paragraphs where they were part of other essays.
Right. I remember you saying that in a different conversation.
But the vast majority were originally written.
And you work as an editor in your day job, right? So
part-time, yeah.
You're thinking about construction all the time. You're thinking about structure. You're thinking about, how do I say this the way it needs to be said? When you're working on your own material, how many drafts are we talking about? What's the process? When do you start? What do you start with?
It has to start with a scene. I think a lot of times when I'm reading people's essays, personal essays, even pitches, they want to start with this grandiose idea. I want to argue so-and-so and so-and-so. And I'm like, but where's the anchor?
Where's the story?
Where's the story? If there's no story,
right?
Then it's like, you're just giving me just all of these abstractions. You have to concretize it. So usually when I think about personal essay, I'm like, it has to start with a vivid scene. I have to pull someone in immediately before I dial it back into these arguments and, meditations and whatnot. So usually I'll just write, the full draft. I usually write in the morning. I'm very, very sharp in the morning. So I usually write in the morning, and usually when I edit it, I'm able to tell, hey, this is too academic. Especially earlier in my career, I always have editors like, too academic, way too academic.
I want to go back to an essay that's called Human Not Black.
Okay.
You're at lunch with a former colleague from school?
Like an advisor, yeah.
An advisor, okay. And her family. And two of the members of her family make it very, very clear that they think you have chosen poorly by identifying as a black woman, that they don't understand why you would do that. They say, well, you're human. We just see you as a human. And actually, one of them thinks you should possibly marry his nephew.
Yeah, or his son who's already married.
It's and I think
a possibility, like before he was married, like you could have married.
It's not an unfamiliar story. If you've been the only person of color in a room, this has happened to you. And it wasn't necessarily ill-intentioned.
But
yet it's based on this very archaic idea that somehow you wouldn't want to actually just be who you are.
I know. And it was so hard because I was like, I'm in somebody's house. I can't raise my voice too high. I'm afraid to even purse my lips because I'm just like, they're going to say something else. But that's the hard part, especially explaining to liberal people, is that it's never well-intentioned. I mean, ill-intentioned. It's never, I want to like specifically hurt you, but that doesn't make the impact less upsetting. And so from their standpoint, it's like, okay, you went to an Ivy League school. You speak these languages, you travel all over the world. That does not signal black to me. And it's interesting, at the time I wanted to be like, well, what does a black woman signal to you? And I didn't even think about it that way. And I think that's something I'm going to use in the future, is just to throw the question back on somebody else. But I mean, an excerpt of that chapter appeared in the New York Times, so many black people I know in their 20s, 30s, 40s, upwards, have been in that situation where it's like, you are not my idea of what a black person looks like. So in order for me to understand you, you have to collapse into just the category of human.
Which is a lot to ask of any person.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, if you think about it, even with feminism, it's like, are you black or are you a woman? And how many moments, and I'll see stuff like this all the time. And it's like, this is why I do the work that I do. Because as long as black women have been writing, we've been telling you about ourselves, but still you expect us to just compartmentalize certain parts of our identities because it just doesn't compute from the other side. Doesn't make any sense. But then that's because I'm a black woman. And I don't ask I have to be conscious of everyone else's identities.
There's a great line in one of the pieces. It might actually be the last. You're expected to be yourself, but not so much that you forget which spaces you occupy, those in which you are the only one or one of the very few. You're outnumbered, and you can either fight to change the game or be so broken by playing the game that you fall into line.
Man, I was going to say I wrote that.
Yes, you did. That is a direct quote. That is an absolute direct quote. That is actually from the final essay in the collection, A Black Girl Like Me. So talk to me about the cover for a second, because it's not often, it is actually incredibly rare for a debut writer to end up on the jacket of their own book.
Yeah. So
on the front jacket, I should say.
I know. So my parents were, they said to me, you should be on the cover of your own book. And I told them, I was like, first of all, in my head, I'm like, they don't know anything about publishing. Like, no. And then I told them, I said, listen, I'm not a celebrity. I'm not a recognizable figure, so they're not going to say yes. And then they were like, just ask. And then I said, you know what? Why don't I just ask? Because you just want to see what happens.
I'm a big believer in just asking.
Just ask it. And so when I emailed my editor, I was like, could I be on it? And I expected we're trying to go with these color palettes. Just like, let me just direct your attention someplace else. And 30 minutes later, she got the okay from the publisher and said, go for it. And so I already had an idea of what I wanted. So if you were to research Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God, the version that HarperCollins published, there's this woman who her head is cocked to the side and her eyes are closed, and you don't know if she's like in mild pain or in deep thought. And so that's what I wanted to do. So I had a photographer who I worked with previously, and we went to the studio in Union Square and we took a couple shots. And even before we went there, I was worried about how to do my hair again, because I was like, should I have my hair curly? Should I have it straight? Should I have it in braids? I did have it in braids. Like, should I take it out? And I was like, and when I talked to my editor, I was expecting her to say, let's market you this way. But she was like, no, just what's your hair like right now? Go for it. Went to the studio. We took a couple shoots, black and white and in color with me, like my eyes closed, glasses on, glasses off. And then we sent it to them. And I was assuming, me, I'm just very nervous person. I'm like, I don't believe something until I actually see it. So when I gave them these pictures to choose from, I just thought they were going to look at them and say, you know what? Let's just scrap it. We'll use this for something else. But we saw the cover and I was like, oh, yeah, it's great. But the reception I got when I revealed it online was just tremendous. Like, I had Black people, men and women, who would reach out to me and say, like, you don't understand, like, what it means for someone to go into a bookstore and see a Black woman on the cover of their own book. And so now I'm like getting nervous because like I'm excited to go to a Barnes & Noble and be like, oh my God, it's my face. It's my face. So it's really cool. And I think it was, for me, it's one of those moments that I won't forget. For as long as I keep writing, I'll say, I was a debut Black female author and my face was on the cover of my book. And I think it needed to be because, as you said, like, I don't hold back in any parts of my book. So just to remind you that there is a person who wrote this. So it was great. I'm really thankful for that opportunity.
Morgan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to our conversation with Morgan Jerkins. To learn more about This Will Be My Undoing, visit barnesandnoble.com/podcast. We've got new episodes with more fascinating voices every week. To make sure you don't miss out, subscribe to the BNN podcast in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Our interview was conducted by Miwa Messer. This episode of the podcast was produced by Bill Tipper, with editing and engineering by Josh Perillo. Our executive producer is Jim Mustick. Barnes & Noble Audio.